Welcome to episode 316 of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. I'm your host, Morgan, aka Bon Diesel, and this week we'll be talking about Xbox staying on message, PlayStation going all in with AMD, Stalker 2 making money already, and much more. Before we get started, subscribe to the Baunfire Gaming Podcast on your favorite podcast app and leave a review on Spotify or iTunes. Or subscribe to the Bon Diesel YouTube channel to get all of my YouTube videos, including this podcast. Thank you to everyone who supports as YouTube members and Twitch subscribers. If you're interested in supporting this podcast and all of my other content, check out the links in the show description. Gaming news. Before we hit our main story, I normally record this podcast during the day when I'm here by myself. Every now and then I have to record it at night when there's a little person sleeping in the next room of a very thin-walled house. So, excuse the ASMR podcast this week and whenever else it happens. But someone always says something whenever I have to do it. And it's just the reality of the thing. So, let's get into the main story. Satya Nadella, CEO of Microsoft, reaffirmed Xbox's intent to bring all of their games to all platforms and to, quote, redefine what it means to be an Xbox fan, unquote. This was received as gracefully as you can imagine. I've just really struggled with all of this because I think it's good that Xbox is trying something different. They're pivoting. They're literally just they're pivoting. It's okay, and it's been so strange to me. I understand that gamers, quote unquote, are going to be weird about this stuff. People don't like change. Humans in general don't like change, and you know we've seen that there's a bunch of like fanboys and stuff like that who are struggling with the idea that the argument we've been having between Xbox and PlayStation fans for the last 20 years is probably going away. And there's a lot of people who have really attached a lot of their personality to this. And unfortunately, it's not just like kids. I think kids probably care less than anyone. You know, young folks, Gen Z or whatever. It's people my age. It's dudes in their 30s and probably even 40s. And so you see that, and I can still appreciate a regular fan, right? Especially if you were in the thick of it back in the day of like the 360 and PS3. And but now I think what's frustrating for me is it's the journalist and the influencers or like the platform like super fans. So, you know, you've got the journalists, we all know who they are, but then you have like the content creators, right? You have, I don't even remember his name, Game Pass Tim or whatever his name was. And he like made a big stink earlier this year when Xbox was daring to do different things and became a PlayStation fan. And now I assume I blocked him years ago or a long time ago. I assume he's sucking up to that fan base now. And like the problem is that you can identify these people who are probably not really even that big of fans of any platform. They've just found a niche and like it must pay good enough. They must get enough ad revenue or whatever it is to justify spending literally all day arguing with people about their favorite plastic box. And it's not even like a fandom thing. Like, I like Xbox. If you've listened to this podcast enough, you know I'm an Xbox fan, and I often call myself an Xbot and things like that. But I don't like, it's not like a part of my personality. The only time I do the console war stuff is when I just think people are just being dishonest about talking about the different platforms and things like that. I don't really care. Xbox could disappear tomorrow and I'd be like, oh man, that sucks. Oh man, I have a lot of games there. I would figure it out, right? I think what I struggle with is especially when it comes to covering this stuff. Xbox really since last gen has been modifying their goal. The simple fact is that this gen and probably last gen as well, Xbox isn't trying to sell more consoles than PlayStation anymore. And I think that's obvious. I think last gen they couldn't. I think this gen they don't care. Their goals are elsewhere. And it's been interesting seeing everyone, but especially, journalists and these influencers who should be more aware or should be more conscious of the industry, and how just completely unwilling those two groups of people are to be like, okay, this is different, but maybe it makes sense. And it's like, even today, when you hear people talk about, who's winning this generation, right? It's PlayStation, of course, right? But that's always based literally just on console sales. Now, that's because those are the numbers that are most probably easy to get and easy to understand. It's very easy to understand there's 60-ish million PlayStation 5s. It's easy to understand there's 30-ish million series consoles, right? And that's a simple number. People are simple for the most part. What we don't know is revenue. What we don't know is profit margin. What we don't know are the things that actually matter to businesses, right? It's, the things that we don't know that actually probably really represent how well a company is doing. The only look we've gotten into this, and something I've talked about a lot, and it may or may not be relevant today, but during the Activision Blizzard King acquisition by Xbox, during the American trial, when they were, fighting the FTC, I believe, for the right to do the acquisition, and PlayStation was in pushing back on it, and various other companies were. We had these documents get leaked by, I believe it was Xbox, or their attorneys accidentally left some files public that shouldn't have been. And we got a glimpse into this fiscal period where PlayStation made a ton of revenue, but they had a ton of expenses. And so the profit margin was lower than Xbox or PlayStation or Nintendo, sorry. And what was interesting about it was that even though Xbox's revenue was like half of PlayStation's revenue, their profit margin and their actual take-home profit, like dollars to dollars, was better. Xbox made more money during that 1 year-ish period, which was really surprising to everyone because, this wasn't like the first year of this generation. It was, I believe, 2021, 2022. And that's interesting because, from the revenue numbers, that's when Xbox was getting their butts kicked by PlayStation, especially in console sales. But consoles don't make that much money. The console is, you get all the profit whenever people buy games, especially digitally that way. And so obviously it's a big marker for profit, but that's not how it worked out. The craziest thing about those records that got released was that Nintendo was making more take-home money, profit, than Xbox and PlayStation combined, even though it had less revenue than PlayStation. I think its revenue was similar to Xbox's, but its profit margin was way better because, they were in the 6th or 7th year of their platform being out, where the other two platforms, they were only in their 2nd or 3rd year. And so we have this situation where if these journalists and influencers were looking at the whole picture, the race between Xbox and PlayStation probably is a lot more complicated and a lot closer than anyone wants to admit. Now, the only reason we got those numbers is because they got leaked. We don't really get accurate numbers from either of these companies in their profit margin, their revenue, all that stuff. We get estimates every now and then. You'll see some estimates from various companies where they take some sales numbers that are public and they try to make them general, and honestly, they're not very reliable. And even they never really talk about the stuff that matters, how sustainable a company is. If you looked at just that one leaked chart, one of those companies is way more viable than the other. And it's, in that case, it was Xbox, but you never saw that conversation. And, the reason, if you're curious, the reason PlayStation's revenue was so high, but their profit margin was so low, is because they're spending $250+ million making games like Spider-Man 2, like Wolverine, like The Last of Us, like Concord, which they then cancel, right? And it's expensive. And so when people complain about Xbox not having these big PlayStation style games, well, we can probably see why now, because it's probably not worth it. Spider-Man 2 sold extremely well, but hasn't made that much profit. It's in the green. It was in the green a while ago, but it's still. And then you have a game, game of the year this year with Astrobot, and it's sold, I think, less than 2 million copies. Now, that game was probably fairly cheap to make, so they're fine. I'm sure they've probably broken even. If not, they're probably making money. But it's just that conversation gets lost. And when we have these situations where Xbox is reaffirming the strategy they're making, I just don't think we get very useful conversations around it. And that's been a trend for a while. Now, predictably, when Satya Nadella says we're going to redefine what it means to be an Xbox fan, all of the people took it the worst possible way. And that's like so frustrating. Like, to me, it was very clearly just being like, yeah, we're changing the way you can access our games. You can buy our console. I promise Xbox is happy to sell you a console, but you don't have to, doing the PC, cloud, Fire Stick, whatever. They're just happy that they're buying you're buying their stuff. And the way this was misconstrued was like, oh, consumers don't want to be told what to like. Like, what are you talking about? Like, it was such a strange reaction. I think it's weird, and it's something I've said a few times, is that it really seems like there's a bunch of people in the game industry who really, really like want or like need Xbox to keep playing second fiddle, that to keep failing. Because for years, Xbox, PlayStation 360 versus PS3, Xbox One, they've tried to do the rat race. They've tried to do the big games that sell the consoles. And in 360 era, they competed well. They still ended up losing, but they did well on the back of like Mass Effect and a bunch of big Gears of War and all those games. But it wasn't sustainable. And then during the Xbox One generation, they had the rough release of the console, which was really good. And then they had like no interesting exclusive games during the entire, Xbox One generation. And it was pretty apparent, even as someone who bought a One X, and the One X is probably my favorite console of all time. But they didn't move any consoles with exclusive games, and that hurt them. So then they did something weird. They stopped emphasizing the consoles. They're still making them, they're still selling them, but they said, okay, Netflix, all these streaming services are so popular, let's do game streaming. And so they did Game Pass. And that's been very successful for them. I don't think people realize how much money they make off of that. Those days of people paying $5 for multiple years of Xbox Live, Game Pass, are gone. So when they have all these subscribers, for the most part, it's people who have paid close to the full price for it. And they have a lot of subscribers. It's a great service. And when they're emphasizing that service, I just think people are so strange about it, where like they're still selling a lot of games. We're going to talk about Stalker 2 toward the end of this episode, a game that's on Game Pass for PC and Xbox that has broken even, and they're making money already. That's because it's, on Steam and on Xbox, on PC, even the Xbox app. People have actually purchased the game. They probably played it on Game Pass, or they checked it out and they liked it, so they just bought it so they could have it, or they went to Steam and bought it, right? There's just this like myth that like Xbox gamers don't buy their games. They obviously do. Not everyone's on Game Pass. A lot are, but not all. It's just strange how weird the coverage is. And like, I really wish there were journalists out there trying to like educate on this strategy. And when you do that, you can still say like, hey, this might not work. This could be a huge disaster. This could be a huge failure. But here's what they're trying to do. and here's how it could work. And instead, every article is, you can see it. It's Xbox's risky strategy. It's always dour. It's always a doomer headline, right? It's always negative, and they're fine. Like, you can tell Xbox is fine. You can tell by the way they act. They're like, yeah, they're making money. At one point, they were the most profitable sector of Microsoft recently. And every time people will be like, well, because Activision Blizzard King is so profitable. Yeah, that's why they acquired them. Like, I just don't think what people see is that Xbox is probably the biggest publisher in the world now. They make their own hardware. They, have access to the cloud. They have access to PC. They have access, they release their games day and date on PC, their own games on PC, on Steam. And they're even putting some of their games on PlayStation. Well, that's happened the other way, very rarely, with games like MLB The Show, because of contractual obligations. It's, they're willing to put their games on another platform. And every time this stuff happens, every game that gets announced, the Outer Worlds 2, the new Doom game, the Indiana Jones, which is like a huge hit. Surprisingly, I don't really like it, but a lot of people do, and it's going to be on PlayStation next year. But all the talk right now, it's happening now. It's on Xbox, PC, and every time this happens, the conversation turns into, why even have an Xbox? Why will I can just get that game on PlayStation, which isn't true. Very little of their library is going to PlayStation, but some of it is. But that money's still going to Xbox. Like, they don't care. And people are so fixated on that, like, PlayStation selling twice as many consoles, therefore they must make twice as much money. And that, from what we can tell, is objectively false. And there's probably an argument to be made that Xbox is probably the more sustainable company today. And these things they're doing probably means they're going to be more sustainable tomorrow, next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So the reaction to the Microsoft CEO, who's out of touch, who doesn't know what he's talking about with Xbox specifically, they're obviously trying to recoup their money from the ABK acquisition. I get it. I'm not blind to those things. But as much as I'm not blind to that, I wish that these people who have influence, journalists, influencers, all that, I wish they would just try. I wish they would just try to be unbiased, to not put, because I think a lot of them know all these things. They know more than I do. They probably talk to people who actually know these things, but it's not profitable to be curious, to explain. It's more profitable to talk about the risk, to talk about the crazy new strategy they're trying that could fail, right? Frustrating, but we'll see how it plays out in the long run. I'm genuinely really curious. I think this industry needs competition. I think Nintendo's doing their own thing, barely competing with anyone else. They're so in their own lane. PlayStation's still running their company like they did 20 years ago, and it's working today. We'll see about the long term. And Xbox is out there shooting their shots and seeing what works. Might work out, might not. We'll see. Moving on to some other stories. Arrowhead has released paid cosmetics for Helldivers 2. It amounts to a $40 set of a gun, helmet, cosmetic, and I think a pose or emote or whatever. It was a crossover event with Killzone, and people freaked out. So now Arrowhead is releasing a second part of this for free. What was so interesting was so many people it came out big in the days after of, well, Arrowhead made this decision on their own. PlayStation didn't make them do this. And the Arrowhead CEO, the head of their studio, said, yep, this was on me, my fault, my bad. We made the wrong choice, which is BS. There is zero chance with the way that they've ran this game with the monetization that they just suddenly went from doing like $5 war bonds where by playing the game, you can earn everything. For $5, you can earn like 8 or 9 different cosmetic sets and new weapons and there's no way that the company who's done that for the last 9 months or whatever suddenly decided to charge $40 for a cosmetic set and a new gun. While they may have made that decision technically, they absolutely were put into that. Now, maybe they did make the decision. My theory is that PlayStation is making them license the Killzone cosmetics, and that was the best way for them to pay for that. Now, with them doing the free second set, that makes that less likely. You would think, because PlayStation owns the Helldivers IP, but Arrowhead is a third-party studio. It's one of those weird situations where it's a Sony PlayStation property, but it's being developed by someone not under their thumb. So, essentially, Arrowhead probably doesn't have as much say as they talk like they do, because they're working on the property that's not theirs. It's the way Sony lends out Spider-Man to Disney for the MCU, right? You know, they let them do it, but they put their thumb on it for sure. So I've gotten back into Helldivers 2 a bit. I still think that game is extremely overrated. It's so good, without a doubt. It's got a very unique just feel of the way it plays, the gunplay, the way it works out. It is a lot of fun. The fun runs out a lot faster. And like knowing that there's people who have played thousands of hours, maxed out the level, I don't know how. Props to them. I'm never going to be mad at someone for finding anything they love, but it definitely wasn't for me. But they are very reactive to their community, for better or worse. They do figure things out eventually, even if it doesn't happen immediately. I think Arrowhead is great. I think they're a really great studio. It seems like the people controlling the strings above them cause them a lot of issues that they kind of have to take the brunt for. And I think that's interesting. Speaking of PlayStation, Mark Cerny, their closest thing to Phil Spencer, even though they have very different skill sets. Mark Cerny and PlayStation had a huge media blitz this week, talking about PlayStation's partnership with AMD, specifically about a thing called Project Amethyst. And what it is basically a cooperative thing they're doing on how to implement machine learning and AI into the future of AMD hardware. It's this essentially, and I believe they just came out and said it, the next PlayStation will have AMD. This was something we confirmed a few months ago when apparently Intel was technically in the race to be the PlayStation hardware provider, but they're going with AMD again, which makes sense. They've done AMD with the PlayStation 4 and 5, and now with the 6, same as Xbox One, Xbox Series consoles, and maybe the next one will also be AMD. PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 had proprietary chips and actually didn't use standard PC like architecture, which is why there are a ton of issues with backwards compatibility. Microsoft handled it really well. Most 360 games are compatible forward. A lot of PlayStation 3 games are stuck there and have never come forward. But this project was interesting, and the way every single tech channel had interviews, every single gaming outlet had interviews with Mark Cerny. This was a very, very purposeful effort by PlayStation to get attention on the PS5 Pro to a point, but mostly the next PlayStation console. And that makes sense. They're probably deep in the trenches of designing it, right? What was interesting about this was all of the conversation was, oh yes, PlayStation's helping AMD with how to implement machine learning, AI, upscaling, all that stuff. They have their PSSR, which is a DLSS or FSR equivalent. These technologies that take like 720p gameplay and boost it up to 4K so that your hardware doesn't have to be powerful enough to do 4K. It only has to be powerful enough to do 720p. And then this machine learning and all this tech can boost it up, right? What was interesting is that in the IGN interview, I found it curious that none of the technology from this Project Amethyst is going to be proprietary. So what's really going on is AMD is working on their own tech for really themselves, for their own Radeon GPUs, for their processors, all that. And PlayStation is probably helping them, I'm sure. but it's not for PlayStation. It's for AMD. And even in the IGN interview, they came out and asked him, like, well, is this going to be proprietary? And he said, no, it's going to be available to all of AMD's customers. And they specifically asked, so could the next Xbox use it if they use AMD? And he can't say the X name, of course, but he said, anyone who works with AMD can use this technology. So I guess that's cool. Even though I still have some theories about whether or not Xbox will use AMD again. We'll have to wait and see. There was another thing that was interesting. He debunked, he called it Flopflation, which was hilarious to see someone like him say. But there's been all these rumors from especially these like hardcore PlayStation fans that the PlayStation 5 Pro has 33 plus teraflops of power. Teraflops is a pretty terrible measure for power anyways, but this was putting it up equivalent to like a 4080 GPU, which is like $1,000. And he came out straight up and said, like, no, it's about 17 teraflops, which is interesting because the PlayStation 5 has a lower teraflop number than the Series X. And the PS5 Pro now isn't really that much higher than the Series X. But obviously, if you've paid attention to the way things have worked out, PlayStation 5 and Series X are basically the same. Some games work better on one or the other. And the PlayStation 5 Pro does things a lot better than the Series X. So again, it's kind of to point out that teraflops number is kind of useless. But it was still interesting to see him push back against, in theory, their own fans. And then, he talked about PS6 and how it's obviously the PS5 Pro is essentially a beta for the PS6. Which is smart. The data they're going to gather for PSSR from the PS5 Pro is going to help the PS6 for sure. It's what we've seen from DLSS from NVIDIA and XeSS from Intel and FSR from AMD. All these technologies, they need data. They need repetition. They need to be used to get better. And so this is definitely a good thing for PlayStation. It does lead me to be curious what Microsoft will do. They certainly are going to have to do something like this, whether they're going to have their own tech, whether they're going to partner with, Intel or NVIDIA. I mean, with AMD, they technically have access to FSR, and future versions of FSR will likely have actual hardware requirements and be similar to DLSS and PSSR, but we'll have to wait and see. We don't know that for sure. So, definitely an interesting insight. The PlayStation definitely wanted this week for themselves, and they, for the most part, got it. Sony also got it by acquiring some of Kodokawa. So this is something we've been talking about for a few weeks. That is who owns From Software, makers of the Souls games, Elden Ring, so on and so forth. And instead of acquiring them entirely, they acquired 10%. They have the most stock. They have the most ownership. Behind them is Tencent with I think 3 or 4% less. And this was interesting. I do believe their intent was to fully acquire. And I'm wondering if there was a financial issue. We are under the impression that Sony probably isn't super cash rich right now. A big difference between Sony and Microsoft. Microsoft is one of, if not the biggest companies in the world. Sony is only as big as some of Microsoft's subsidiaries. Sony, as a whole company, beyond PlayStation, isn't very big. They're two companies in two different classes. And so when it comes to money and financing is very expensive right now, for this deal, they just straight up may not have had the cash to fully acquire. I fully believe that over time, they're going to acquire more and more of Kodokawa, and eventually they are going to own Kodokawa, From Software, Elden Ring, all those IPs. It's eventually going to happen. This is an obvious intent, but I assume for money flow reasons, they probably just weren't able to do it yet, but expect to see that in the future. I would be amazed if they would go full exclusive with From Software IP, maybe new ones, maybe certain ones they would do it. But, you saw how Elden Ring sold and how popular it was. It would probably be kind of dumb to restrict that to one console. And especially with the way they are, with the way that they release on PlayStation and then release on PC 2 or 3 years later, that just probably isn't going to fly with From Software fans, though some of their games are exclusive to PlayStation in the past. So we'll see. Capcom announced that they are going to be bringing back dormant IPs. They didn't list any specific ones, but for the most part, people were all screaming for Dino Crisis was the big one. I have to imagine the experience they've gotten with remaking the Resident Evil games, and those being, for the most part, huge successes, especially Resident Evil 2. Yeah, I mean, obviously, and Resident Evil 4 was very popular as well. I assume they're going to take those lessons and keep moving them forward. And they release those games at a pretty steady clip. And they're probably due to release a new Resident Evil game sooner than later. I would imagine by 2026. I wouldn't be surprised at all if in 2025 we get an announcement for a new game. So I'll be curious to see that. I like Capcom. I've enjoyed those remakes. I've played a few of them. I actually didn't like Resident Evil Village. I kind of thought it sucked. I hated it. I thought it looked really awful. I definitely didn't have the love for it other people did, but different strokes, and that's okay. The Borderlands 4 narrative director implies that the next game will have less toilet humor and will have a more serious tone. This came from, they told an anecdote where apparently someone, I think it was Paul Tassi, asked them something of like, if they were going to have like a Bazooka Tua or something gun, like referencing the Hawk Tua girl. And he was so dismayed by that another developer asked him like, hey, are we really doing that? He was so like upset by that he's like making it a point that the next Borderlands game maybe won't have the same tone entirely as the other ones. I don't like the Borderlands games. I've tried to get into them. As a Division fan, there was a lot of crossover there, despite how different the games are. I didn't think it was funny. I thought it was very cringy. Like I just felt like embarrassment every time I played that game, and I thought the gunplay felt terrible. The things people love about that series, I have just never picked up on, but that's just a me thing. Some interesting news here. Valve and Xbox will be attending Lenovo's handheld event at CES in January. Specifically, Xbox's Jason Ronald will be there, who is most recently named the VP of Next Generation. He was, you may remember, if you're an Xbox fan, in the lead up to the series consoles, there was a guy who was doing interviews like every week who had a bald head and a big long beard like down to his knees. That's him. Super cool guy, very knowledgeable, very obviously like an engineer for sure, who has gained some prominence and has to do some talking every now and then. Between him, Sarah Bond, I think they're in good hands. A lot of speculation about this event is that Lenovo is going to have access to Steam's OS that they use on the Steam Deck, and that there may be a native app that Xbox is going to have. Now, the ideal for Xbox is to release, to have their OS, like a mobile version of it on these handhelds, so it's a better experience. The most interesting thing that's come up in the Windows Central specifically had an article about this where they said that they've heard rumors that Xbox may be shopping out the Xbox OS and the Xbox name to other hardware manufacturers. And if you're a PC gamer, what would be, I think, a viable strategy, it would be really interesting for Xbox to try, would be to do like the GPU thing. So like NVIDIA, when they release a new GPU, say the 50 series that's coming out soon, let's say a 5090, their super expensive card, they will release an OEM version, a NVIDIA 5090. And it'll typically be the MSRP, the cheapest price, and they're really good. They're almost always excellent, really good hardware. And then shortly after, Gigabyte, Asus, Acer, all these different companies will release their own 5090, and they're typically more expensive because they have more fans or different cooling solutions, or they overclock them or whatever. And the idea is that Xbox may do something similar where they have an official Microsoft Xbox, the next the Xbox 2, whatever. They put that out. And then in the months after that, Gigabyte and Asus release essentially their own Xboxes that have the Xbox OS on it. But maybe instead of like the next Xbox, we'll say it has the equivalent to a 5070, the new NVIDIA GPU. Well, Gigabyte could put out the Gigabyte Xbox that would have like a 5090 in it. It's going to be like $1,000 or $1,500, but it's going to have that Xbox utility, simplicity, but with much better hardware. The real kicker for a strategy like that would be that if the OEM, ideally the Microsoft one, but especially the third-party Xbox consoles, if they could dual boot to Windows. So you could have this system that you could boot into Xbox mode, and it works just like an Xbox, but it has even better hardware. And then you could switch it over to just being a PC. Now that may come more in the form of just having PCs and having an Xbox app that behaves basically like the Xbox OS. We're getting beyond my knowledge base here. But again, when it comes to Xbox's strategy, I think there's a lot more good things that could happen than bad. And I think this stuff, as well as the handhelds and all this stuff, will end up being a good thing in the long run. But you're going to see traditionalists and people who are used to things being the way they are kick and scream into this. And until it's unquestionably successful, that's just going to continue. So I'm curious to what comes from Lenovo, why these high-powered people are going to be there. And I think it's CES in general is a fun time. And this year, this one in 2025, January, is probably going to be pretty exciting. So be ready for me to bore you about that. Secret Level, the Blur Productions Season 1 fully released this week. This was the animated little short films that address different games. It was okay. There were definitely some standouts. The Warhammer episode was really cool. The Outer Worlds 2 episode was really, really cool. There were a handful of really good ones. There were some real stinkers too, man. The Crossfire X one was just like a weird military short, because that's all that game is. It's not even popular here. The Sony one, the very last one, was awful. You could tell Sony really probably put their thumb down on what that could be, because all the other ones were like relatively creative takes on the franchise, and then the Sony one was just a commercial, and they're all commercials. I get it. But this one specifically was like a super, super commercial. It was weird. It was strange. It was very odd, but oh well. Enough people seem to like it. So it's getting a season 2, which is really exciting. I am extremely excited because the director of the next Mass Effect game, Michael Gamble from BioWare, retweeted the announcement about season 2. And he doesn't do much on social media. Maybe he loved season 1 and he's just excited. I would say because of the timing, it's probably going to come out in like late 25, 26. I can almost guarantee they're doing transmedia deals at BioWare with Blur to put a Mass Effect episode in the season 2. And if it comes out in like 2026, it would be a great way to do a little 10, 15 minute short that maybe does something to connect Mass Effect 3, Andromeda, and this next game they have coming. It would be a good opportunity for them to bridge that gap a little bit and start preparing people for whatever that next game is going to be. So exciting stuff. Stalker 2, it's already turning a profit. Good for them. That game was in really rough shape when it released. I still beat it though, and I really, really loved it. Really great story, great characters, fun world to play in. Had to restart like every 15, 20 minutes because of some RAM, some memory leak issues it had, but still ended up really enjoying it. They've done a ton of fixes, had a few big patches come out. I've been playing it here and there again, just to take a slower approach to it. This time I kind of rushed through it the first time. It's a big success for them beyond their circumstances with Ukrainian developer. a Russian hacking group stole the whole game last year and leaked it all. Them having to release the game obviously early, it wasn't ready. Them fixing it up so quickly, it being on Game Pass for PC and Xbox, and then it still turned a profit that quickly. That's a big deal, and it's really a good example of how just because the game is on Game Pass day one and it's not on PlayStation, it can still do well financially. That means that people bought it on Xbox PC, on Steam. It means that so many people bought it, because I assume that's not counting the profits they get from whatever deal they have for Game Pass. So good for them, good for GSD, Game World. I just, get those patches out quick so I can do my second playthrough. A bit of side news for Stalker. Apparently they have a deal with Netflix to do a show that will fit extremely well. It's a very grounded world with a little sci-fi to it. A Stalker show could be extremely good. Then the last thing I have here is Escape from Tarkov is nearing its 1.0 final release. I think that's supposed to happen next year in 2025. We're getting close to Christmas, so they're going to be doing one of their wipes soon in a big patch. It's supposed to be like a really big patch. It's not 1.0, but it's probably putting them towards that. And I think I'm going to buckle in and really play this wipe and actually really do it. If anyone plays, I got to level 23 in this last wipe, and I never even unlocked Jaeger. So I'll leave that for anyone who actually plays to know how stupid that is. For some content updates, my next episode will be my Game of the Year episode. It's where I'm going to talk about all my favorite games this year. I'm going to rank them. I've been posting some rankings. I'm mixing them up a little bit, but I'm going to talk about all that. I'm going to talk about some plans I have for 2025, and we'll be doing all of that in episode 317 that I will record next week after Christmas. So if you're still here, thanks for bearing with my voice. Thanks for bearing with all the stops and restarts. I maybe wasn't quite ready to do this yet, but you get your ASMR episode, and that's where I'm going to wrap it up. If you have any of your own topics, questions, or feedback, be sure to let me know in my Discord, in the YouTube comments, or hit me up on social media at Bondiesel or at the Baunfire. That is all I have for this episode of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time.